So shall I?
Recording is on.
Welcome to the Global International Pedagogical Forum, IPF 2021. My name is Karen, and I would like you to welcome our today's guest, Mr. Pedro Simas, virologist and researcher at Institute of Molecular Medicine and University of Lisbon. Good morning, Mr. Simas. We do appreciate you took your time to participate in the forum and answer some of our questions. Thank you.
Good morning. It's my pleasure.
Lovely. So I would like to start our today's conversation with the question that, it has been already half a year since the world known about coronavirus, COVID-19 to be more precise. So the pandemic has already spread around the whole globe. And in this regard, I would like to know your opinion, Mr. Simas. Will there be the second or the third waves?
Okay, that's a very good question, a question in everybody's minds. It will depend on human behavior. Surely the virus is not going to disappear. It's endemic, and endemic means it belongs to a region, and now it's actually pandemic. And pandemic because there is a large population of the world which is susceptible to infection. And so because we are at the very beginning of this pandemic, with at the most with 20% herd immunity, it means that a lot, and 20% herd immunity only in some parts like New York, but all over the world, the herd immunity is about 5 or 3%. So there is a large potential for a second wave or a third wave. Now, why do I say it depends on human behavior? Because these viruses, they spread through droplets in the air, respiratory droplets. So we now know and have the tools to prevent that infection. And you know that all the countries that used lockdowns and confinement of people, they controlled the first wave and they put it down to a base level. But if you relax these measures, then the virus comes back because we are at the very beginning of the pandemic. And look what is happening in Australia. They had the first wave, which is small, like in Melbourne, and then they had a baseline, and now it's growing again. They have clearly a third wave, a second wave. It's very easy to identify. So it really depends how we behave as society. And look at Europe. In every country that they now have relaxed the measures of social distancing, now the virus is coming in small outbreaks. And so if these outbreaks become large, it will get a second wave, okay? So, so to answer your question, the second wave will come, but its size will depend in the way we behave.
All right, that makes it clear. Although another thing I would like to make clear for our audience, is it true that high temperature, which is usual for summer season in our hemisphere, in the northern one, so is the temperature affect the virus? Does the temperature affect the virus? And in other words, does the heat affect the spreading of the virus, or it is not proven yet?
It's well known that heat and temperature and UV radiation affect viruses and transmission of viruses. Now, the point here is that because this virus is in a pandemic state, and meaning that there are many people that are susceptible to infection, these effects of temperature and UV radiation and heat are not very pronounced in trying to stop new infections. And you have to look at countries like near the equator and that have a lot of solar exposition and high temperature, and the virus is thriving in these countries. So in the pandemic virus, to summarize my answer, these effects are not very dominant. In an endemic virus, which is a virus that is in equilibrium with the population, like the seasonal respiratory viruses, yes, in that case, because the virus is in equilibrium, these factors like temperature and UV radiation, they affect transmission in a pronounced way.
Okay, And what about the belief that children suffer less from the COVID infection than adults? If so, in your opinion, Mr. Simmons, what would be the reason for that?
It's not a belief, it's a fact.
Okay.
The children, they suffer less, not only children, the majority of the human population, the virus provokes or causes a very mild infection, and the high risk groups, meaning the people that are affected with severe disease with this SARS-CoV-2 infection, are very well defined. These are people that are either old, and not only old, it's old, but with certain diseases associated with their age. Also, other people of any age that somehow they have their immune system compromised. Okay, so why is this? These viruses, they have typically evolved to cause mild upper respiratory infections and cause very little inflammation, and so they are not systemic. But if a person is somehow vulnerable because of age and associated diseases, it will the infection it will evolve to a lung infection and can cause severe disease. As you can see, this is a very a serious disease in these people. And but these people are also susceptible to more or less any kind of respiratory infection. The reason you see more infection and more disease, severe disease in these high-risk groups these days is because since we are in a pandemic state, there are so many people infected in the world that you see these diseases to be very common. Yeah. But look, if you look at other coronaviruses that already exist in the human population, they typically don't cause much problems because there is a herd immunity that protects the elderly. How does it work? The probability of a normal coronavirus infect the high-risk people, it's very small. So the cases of severe infection in these people are very rare. Mm-hmm. It's not a belief, it's a fact that most people, not only children, young adults, and even elderly people that are healthy, the virus doesn't cause much disease. Obviously, as you grow older, you get a bit more disease, and there's a variation there. But majority, it's an asymptomatic mild infection.
Okay, I just would like to make a little note for our audience. I'm afraid that we're expecting some little technical efforts, so I do apologize in advance if any video or any audio is lacking or with a delay. And I would like to move on with our conversation to the next question. So we are all aware about washing hands, keeping social distance, all these measures are well known for us already. But in your opinion, Mr. Simas, are there any other proven measures that can reduce or slow down the spreading of the virus? For example, the question is, can COVID-19 be killed by the ultraviolet light or quartz coating of the premises or clothing, anything like that?
Okay, that's an important question. I will answer directly your question now. UV and all those treatments you said, they can severely inactivate or affect the virus and inactivate the virus. But let me put that into context. Look, these viruses, I've just had a message in my computer that the sound is a problem with the sound. But do you have, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, like with a bit of sounds, but still more or less.
Okay, so what you mentioned before, we know very clearly now how these viruses are transmitted from person to person. Okay, and so the rule of physical distancing, overcome close contact, closed spaces, crowded spaces, with wearing of a mask, and have some hygiene with hand washing, they're extremely effective. The general director of the CDC in the United States, he was very clearly stating that the CDC had done modeling of this pandemic, and he clearly stated that these measures are equivalent to the complete lockdown of a country. So they really work. Now, all the other measures you mentioned, obviously they work, but for example, this virus is very sensitive. Mm-hmm. It needs droplets to be transmitted from person to person. Mm-hmm. And so I've myself done testing, and I've isolated the virus in the Institute of Molecular Medicine. And if I leave the virus, 200,000 infectious units, on a piece of cotton for 24 hours, the next day there is no virus there detected. Okay?
All right.
So it's a very sensitive virus. And so there is no need to treat this virus like certain viruses that are amongst the human population, like gastroenteritis virus and other viruses, that really need strong disinfection measures, like spraying the streets, spraying houses, and all of that. For this virus, we don't need that. And we know, and it's a fact all over the world, that these viruses, if you simply adopt these social physical measures and wear a mask, it works extremely well. You could control very large waves like in New York. You could control the wave and put down the wave to a base level dramatically. So this is my answer.
Okay, and one of the most concerning topics, I believe, about the coronavirus outbreak during the last several months is about self-isolation. So what do you think? Is this measure effective enough? And if it is, like, maybe the way that it was done is correct or not, or what is the right way, if I can say so, to self-isolate? How necessary is that?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm a virologist, so it's not difficult for me to answer that question, but it's got more implications than the biology of the virus. Look, if a person is infected, okay, it should try to prevent transmission to other people. And so we know that physical distancing and the wear of mask can severely affect transmission. Now, whether the person needs to be isolated or not, we're talking about a person that is infected, epidemiologists and public health experts say, and me as a virologist, we say, look, it's better if the person is somehow not contacting with other people. Now, whether you call that self-isolation, because it's a very strong term, isolation. It looks like very aggressive. It's not like that. It's people trying, if a person knows that is infected and contagious to other people, then you have the moral behavior in society to try not, in a situation like this of pandemic, try not to disseminate the virus. And so it should perhaps contain himself or herself to more confinement in order during 2 or 3 weeks until the virus has gone, the infection has gone, so in order to prevent infection to others. So in that sense, yes, I agree with some form of physical distancing of people that are infected. Yes, obviously.
Right. So, Mr. Simas, we already somehow mentioned the immunity for coronavirus COVID-19. I just want to make it absolutely clear. Is that true that people who already had this infection caused by COVID-19 cannot get infected the second time or further on?
It's true for these viruses. What we know for these viruses, coronaviruses, that when they infect a person, they cause most of the infections are, as we said before, are mild, and so they induce a weak inflammatory response, and so they induce immunity, which is shorter lived than for other viruses, like, for example, measles. That once you get infected with measles, you generate an immunity that is for life, more or less. So you cannot get infected the second time with measles in principle. Now, these viruses have evolved in a different way. They survive in nature by infecting lots of people in a mild way. That's why you get colds every winter, okay? And so, but that's not a problem, because an equilibrium is established in the population, that you have an herd immunity, and then every so often you get infected, and then you boost your immunity. So you go from 1 year immunity, then you get infected, then you get another 1 year or 2 years immunity, and then you get infected again, and it's not a problem because it doesn't cause a great deal of disease. If reinfection was a problem, you would have already seen it with this coronavirus. Look, if reinfection was a problem, 6 months have passed since China had its first wave, since New York had a big wave, and now you would see these people that got infected the first time would now, some of them would come up with infections a second time. And this is not happening, which means that, like any other infectious agent, these viruses, they cause an immunity. But I wouldn't say that is a sterile immunity for life. It's immunity that is short-lived. It may last 6 months, it may last 1 year or 3 years, but then there is an equilibrium of constant reinfection, a constant boosting of the immune system.
Okay. I would like now to talk more about tests for coronavirus. Please tell me if I'm wrong, but as I know, there are nowadays mainly two types of tests, right? The first one is called viral test, which actually takes the sample of the swab from your throat or nose, and it actually shows if you have coronavirus now at the moment, right? And the second one is the blood test, which allows you to detect antibodies in your blood, which actually can say if you had COVID already or not. My question is, are these tests actually reliable, and how informative are they?
Okay, they are reliable and very informative and crucial as tools to fight this pandemic, and they have been for the last 50 years or 80 years in the human history. Okay, so let me explain to you. The first test you mentioned is the test that specifically detects the nucleic acid, the genome of the virus. So it tells you at that very moment whether you are infected or not, and that is very important, as you mentioned, to prevent the dissemination of the virus, and so for the person to somehow self-isolate and not transmit the virus to other people. Okay. Now the second test, and let me go back again a little bit. So before I go to the second test, so the first test is extremely reliable. Okay. Obviously, so you don't get false positives, but you may get a false negative that you also might not have been done correctly, and it might be, but it's not a problem. It's extremely reliable. Okay. Now the second test, it's a bit more controversial because immunity and short-term immunity, and we have what we have discussed just a moment ago. So the second test, what it tells us is if a person has got antibodies specific to SARS-CoV-2 that caused COVID-19. And why is that so important? Because it tells us if a people has already been exposed to infection, okay? And so we want to know, because we know that this pandemic will only stop if you get a certain degree of herd immunity in the population. People that somehow are resistant have contacted the first time with this virus, even though if in 3 months' time or a year's time or 2 years' time they get another reinfection. That's not a problem. Okay, and so only if we know that, we know what's happening in the world, and we have somehow an idea when this is going to stop. Now, the other thing is, which is more controversial, is whether we can use this information in individual sense to say, okay, I've had already infection. Now I am not a problem to other people because I'm immune. I'm not going to transmit the virus to another person. Now, this is controversial. Why? Because, as we said, the way we are measuring immunity is by looking at the antibody levels, those antibodies that neutralize the virus. And they can be short-lived in people, or they cannot be at a concentration which is very high because inflammation was not very high and disease was very mild. And so people are a bit nervous by giving a certificate like an immune passport and say, okay, I've been diagnosed as being seropositive with antibodies against this virus, and now I'm not a threat to the high-risk people, so I can visit confidently my grandparents or whatsoever. So, and that is a bit more tricky in that sense, the information it gives us, because there is still a possibility that you may be reinfected and being transmitted the virus. So we have to wait a little bit longer, a few more months, to be more confident about at the individual, in the individual terms, whether you can use that information to in a public health way. But that information in a community way, in a society way, is extremely important, because we see, if you don't do this serological studies in countries, we are completely blind of what is happening. Okay, and so, for example, we know that Spain has got more or less 5% herd immunity. Madrid has got about 10%. New York has had 20%. Portugal has got about 3%, and we, in principle, need to achieve 60%. Even for the vaccines, when they come, we need to know how much percentage of the population we need to inoculate and vaccinate in order to achieve this equilibrium state and the virus to stop being pandemic and becoming endemic.
Great. So since you already mentioned the vaccine as another concern, and we hear from here and there that different countries are working on the vaccine, they are developing their versions of it. In your opinion, when should we estimate actually the vaccine? And another thing that comes across my mind, that this date actually can be delayed, that is because it is known that this virus mutates a lot. So let's say 6 months ago it started in China, in Wuhan, and that type of virus, which is now around Europe and America, is much highly infectious than the original one. So could you say some comments about that?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important question. It comes up on a regular basis, and it's important to keep answering that question so people can understand. Look, in terms of when we can expect a vaccine, I'm very optimistic these days. There are more than 160 projects on vaccines all over the world. This is quite unique in the world. Now, it had never happened before. And we know that 6 of those projects are already in a phase in phase 3 of clinical trials. What does that mean for students? So I can explain. It means that there are 6 vaccines already being given to people, and large cohorts, groups of people, thousands of people. And so you have 2 groups: people that get a vaccine and people that get a vaccine which is a fake vaccine. And so to compare in the real world whether the vaccine can protect, because we already know, and this is really important. That's why I'm very optimistic about, or cautiously optimistic, because you can never guarantee that until we do these tests that I've just explained, the phase 3 tests. We can never tell if a vaccine is completely safe or effective in preventing infection or preventing disease, because that's another thing. And so, and why am I optimistic? Because when we did these tests in the earlier phase of development, phase 1 and phase 2, we saw we saw that when we gave it to humans mounted a very good immune response in terms of antibodies, so good as someone, or even better, that had recovered from severe lung disease, severe respiratory disease. So this is a very strong indication that these vaccines, they can induce strong immunity. Now, whether these vaccines are going to completely prevent infection in people or just allow infection but prevent severe disease is a question that we have to determine. And now these studies are exactly to address that, okay? Inoculating thousands of people and comparing it whether it protects and it's safe. And I must say that some people say that we are rushing these trials. I don't think we are rushing, because we have amazing technology and experiments now can be done much faster. And so that's what it's becoming so, it's so fast. We talk about 12 months or 18 months, and now we're seeing that it's shorter, okay? So vaccines, when they will come, we will know whether they are safe or not and what kind of protection they confer. Now, regarding the mutations, this is your second part of the question.
Yes.
Look, this is a very big misunderstanding about these viruses. Look, it's not a problem with these coronavirus mutations for the vaccine. That's the direct answer to your question. Now, let me elaborate a little bit. All RNA viruses, they, as part of their natural cycle of infection, they accumulate mutations. For example, you know that influenza, okay? They accumulate a lot of mutations in a particular protein, which is called the hemagglutinin. And also the other one is a neuraminidase, so 2 proteins. And they have evolved exactly to do that. They have evolved to survive or persist in a population of humans by changing constantly the antigenic sites of these proteins. So they cause a very strong disease, very strong immunity, and in order to escape that selective pressure, they keep changing, okay? Now, the coronavirus are not like that. The coronavirus have a completely different strategy. They change a little bit, but not antigenically. And they start an equilibrium in the population that is reinfection. They cause a weak immunity, and then they can reinfect the same person throughout life. So it's completely different. So it is not expected that with these viruses will antigenically change in a way that influenza changes, and that will affect vaccination. That happens with vaccines against coronaviruses in animals, in domestic animals. We have some against coronavirus infections in domestic animals, and that it's not a problem, the antigenic variation, not with the same degree as it occurs with influenza. Now, look, you mentioned that, but we know already that these viruses can change, can mutate, and some viruses are even more infectious now, like in the United States. That is true, but it's not antigenically different. It's not a variant, okay? It's even good news that the virus has changed to become more infectious, because the more infectious a virus is, it means that it can infect more people. And the reason why it can infect more people is because it causes less disease. And so it's more silent, clinically silent. And so that's good news for the human population, okay? So in terms of vaccine and vaccine usage and development, mutations of these viruses are not going to be a problem. And the final thing, just to finish off, RNA viruses usually mutate a lot, but they usually are very small, like HIV and like influenza. They are HIV is about less than 10,000 nucleotides. But these coronavirus, are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, known RNA virus. They are about 30,000 nucleotides. So they have systems to correct the mutations and to control the level of mutations. So these viruses, although they can mutate, they can also be very stable in their phenotypic biological features.
All right, so that actually makes more and more sense through our conversation. And in conclusion, I would like to ask you the last but not the least question. Actually, my question is going to be related to some of the previous questions that I already asked. So, in your opinion, just to conclude and summarize everything that we discussed today, is it possible for a person who already had COVID-19 to be contaminated with its mutated version?
Oh,
Or the immunity is only for one, let's say, type of COVID?
in fact, it's the other way around. We know that there is a lot of cross-reactive immunity amongst coronavirus even at the antibody level and at cellular immunity. So it's not like these viruses have different variants, antigenic variants. Like, for example, rhinoviruses have more than 100 what we call serotypes. It's like they react differently to our antibodies, okay? But coronaviruses, usually there is only one serotype, okay? That doesn't change antigenically, but there is some degree of antigenic cross-reactivity between one type of coronavirus and another type of coronaviruses. For example, the human population, there are 4 coronaviruses already, and now this is the 5th one. So there is a lot of talk about that. One of the reasons why this infection is so mild is because we already have some kind of cross-reactive recognition of this virus, immunity at the cellular level. So I wouldn't put it in the sense that these viruses have different antigenic variants, and then a person, when it's immune to one variant, is not going to be immune to another variant, and it can become infected. It doesn't work like that with coronaviruses. Okay. In a way, there is a lot of cross-reactivity, if anything.
Yeah. Great, Mr. Simas. I think that's all we would like to discuss with you today. I would like to thank you once again for your time and your opinion you shared with us about these very burning issues for the population of the world today, I would say. I would like just to wish you take care and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.